Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Andy Staples. I'm the Director of Research and Outreach at the Hinrich Foundation here in Singapore. Thank you very much for joining us for this RSIS and Hinrich Foundation event today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes for everybody who's just joined as we get underway. The chat and raise hand function today has been disabled, but we would be delighted if you could send your questions to us via the Q&A function of Zoom, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be going through that regularly to see what your questions are and posing those to the panel. This is a 90-minute session. We'll be looking to finish at 11 o'clock. Today's theme is on US-China relations, which, as we all know, have deteriorated over recent years to such a point that the current situation has been described as a new Cold War. Today, our focus is on whether this Cold War necessarily means that a hot war is inevitable, something I think we could all agree that we would wish to avoid. Beyond this initial theme, however, we'd like to explore related issues, such as the forthcoming US presidential election, and practical steps that policymakers around the region, around the world, can be taking to de-risk the situation as well. And to help us do that and to bring in various perspectives from the US, from Australia, from Southeast Asia, from China, I'm delighted to be joined today by our distinguished panel. The full bios of our panel are available on the website, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at that. But just very briefly, Dr. Alan Dupont is the Hinrich Foundation Research Fellow and CEO of the Cognoscenti Group. Dr. Dupont is one of Australia's best-known strategists and thought leaders on geopolitical risk, foreign policy, defence and national security. Dr. Dupont had a distinguished career over 25 years in public service as an army officer, as a defence intelligence analyst and a diplomat. And Dr. Dupont has recently published a paper on this very theme titled De-risking the New Cold War. And I would urge you to go and find that on the Hinrich Foundation site. We're also joined by Dr. Amy Searight, Senior Associate for Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC, one of the US's leading think tanks. Dr. Searight had a distinguished career, which included stints as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia and Principal Director for East Asian Security at the Department of Defense. We're also joined by Professor Joseph Liow, the Tan Kah Kee Chair in Comparative and International Politics at Nanyang Technological College here in Singapore, and Professor at RSIS, where he was also formerly Dean. Professor Liow has previously held the inaugural Lee Kuan Yew Chair in Southeast Asia Studies at the Brookings Institute, also in Washington. And finally, delighted to welcome Professor Zhu Feng, Executive Director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea, and a Professor of International Relations at Nanyang University. Professor Zhu is a leading Chinese security expert and was formerly Deputy President of the Institute for Strategy and International Studies at Peking University. To my panel, thank you all for joining us today, and I'm delighted to welcome you here. So with that, let me get underway. And what I'm going to do is invite our panel to share their thoughts, their initial thoughts on the theme of today. We're going to then move into more of an interactive discussion session. And again, I would urge you to be sending through your comments and questions for us to consider as we go through the morning. With that, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Dupont. And Dr. Dupont, I mentioned earlier on that you recently published a paper on this very theme. And I think it'd be useful at the outset if you could describe to us some of the key findings of that paper and why you're calling this a new Cold War.
Yes, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for that introduction, Andy. It's a great pleasure to be part of this RSIS webinar hosted by the Hinrich Foundation. So what I'm going to do is just basically summarize for you a couple of the key points of my paper. And to address Andy's question, why do I think this is a new Cold War? Well, My central thesis in the report that I've written for the Hinrich Foundation is that the US-China relationship has moved from a predominantly cooperative framework to one of strategic rivalry. And that in recent years, and particularly in the last 6 to 12 months, this rivalry has escalated alarmingly and has already taken us into what Henry Kissinger has called the foothills of a new Cold War. Now, this is still contentious, and not everybody agrees that we're in a Cold War, but I think it's fair to say that over the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a significant shift in thinking from the expert community as well as publicly, that indeed we are, if not on the threshold of the Cold War, certainly in the foothills of one. Now, why do I use the Cold War metaphor here? I use it deliberately because if you go back to the First Cold War, which is essentially a contest between the Soviet Union and the United States, and virtually every country was aligned on one side of that fence, there are 6 very striking parallels. And I think the first one is that this is a contest between the world's 2 largest, most powerful countries, one obviously a liberal democracy, and the other avowedly communist and authoritarian. Secondly, it's a system-wide contest for supremacy. So this is not just a set of territorial or trade disputes between the United States and China. It's really about a contest across the board, and it's affecting every aspect of their relationship. It's about trade, it's about technology, it's about geopolitics, it's about many, many things. So it's systemic. Thirdly, the contest is as much about ideology, as belief systems, if you like, as well as competing national interests. Fourthly, like the First Cold War, this will be a multi-decadal struggle for supremacy, global ascendancy. Fifth, I think that it's going to precipitate a bifurcation of the world into 2 competing blocks. I don't think these blocks will be as rigid as that of the First Cold War, but I certainly think that countries are going to be under pressure to choose to go with the US or with China. That is a position no one wants to be in, but unfortunately we're moving into that position. And sixthly, I don't think either side, either China or the US, wants a full-scale military confrontation, but one cannot be ruled out. So in short, it's not your run-of-the-mill great power conflict, which we have many examples of over the last several hundred years. This is a very rare systemic competition by the 2 leading powers of the day, and it's ideological as well as interest-based. Now, as I said, while a lot of the headlines have been around the trade war, the so-called trade war between the US and China, and also more recently the tech conflict between them, and these are 2 very important dimensions of their competition, my argument is that at its heart, this is essentially a geopolitical contest. It's rooted in the competing ambitions of the United States and China to be the preeminent state of the 21st century. Their diametrically opposed values and political systems and their sense of exceptionalism. What I mean by that is both China and the US believe they have an historic right to be the #1 country in the world. So it makes it very difficult to find accommodation when 2 countries feel that way. Now, having said all that, I do acknowledge that there are important differences between the First and the Second Cold War, or Cold War 1.0, 2.0, if you want to put it in modern terminology. So I think the key difference is that, unlike the Soviet Union and the United States, the US and China are joined at the hip economically. And so there are a lot of reasons why the US and China do not want to decouple their economies, do not want to engage in competition, because it's going to be mutually detrimental to both of them to do so because of their economic interdependence. And a lot of trade economists will argue that the greater trade dependence or interdependence there is, the less likely there is going to be war or conflict. Well, I beg to differ. I think that while that is generally true, there are important exceptions. If you go back and look at Germany and Great Britain before the First Cold War, back before the First World War, both countries were joined at the hip economically before they went to war. So it can happen when one or both countries believes that the benefits of interdependence are outweighed by the security risks of overdependence. And that's where I think the US and China are at the moment. Okay, so the big question is, could this Cold War turn into a hot war? Now, on balance, I think at the moment that's not going to happen. We're more likely to see a festering, contained rivalry characteristic of a Cold War. But if you look at the historical record, it's hard not to be concerned and perhaps even pessimistic, because if you, over the last 500 years, of the 16 major conflicts between a rising power and a ruling power, 12 of them have resulted in war. Harvard's Graham Allison has encapsulated this in his pretty famous phrase now about Thucydides' trap. This is a reference to the great Athenian historian who, when he was chronicling the Peloponnesian Wars 2,500 years ago, observed that war between Sparta and Athens broke out because it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. And unfortunately, the historical record does bear that out most of the time. Other studies, notably by Chinese scholar Jia Jingguo and Richard Rosencrantz, come to similar conclusions. So if you look at Asia, where most of the competition is playing out, the most likely triggers for military conflict between the US and China are Taiwan and the South China Sea. Now, I'm not going to go into this now because I know some of the other speakers will want to draw this out, but we'll come back to those trigger points, I think, a little bit later on. Now, just to really conclude, so what can we do about it? I mean, this is a pretty gloomy prognosis, and it's easy to feel that we feel collectively that all we can do is throw our hands up. There's not much we can do about it. Well, I argue that there is a lot we can do about it. And in my key 7 recommendations for de-risking US-China conflict, I'd just like to focus on one that I think has particular relevance for Singapore. And that recommendation is that the rest of the world, the rest of us, can't allow the US and China to be great again at our expense. And we have a stake in this competition. Certainly we have a stake in the outcome. And if the US and China are unwilling to settle the differences, then the rest of the world must act. And there are many opportunities for meaningful and effective middle power diplomacy, in my view, using existing multilateral institutions and established second track processes with which Singapore is very familiar, and in fact has been the meeting place for a lot of these second track dialogues, such as the Council of Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. So my point is that as a leading middle power in Asia and a country that has good relations with China and the United States, there are opportunities for Singapore to work cooperatively with like-minded middle powers to urge the US and China to de-escalate their rivalry and develop perhaps a suite of confidence-building measures that reduce the risk of conflict, build trust, and encourage greater transparency and openness. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there, and over to you, Andy.
Dr. Dupont, thank you very much for surveying the landscape for us there and mapping out some key issues for us to come back to. This issue of middle power diplomacy, the role of Singapore, is something I'm very interested to hear from Professor Liow about a little bit later on. But before we get there, let's stay with the big powers, and I'd like to move over to Dr. Searight now to get the view from Washington. Dr. Searight, over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, I do agree that there's been a rise of not only tensions, but I think there's intensifying strategic rivalry between China and the United States. And I think in Washington, the view, the toughening view on China has been driven by several things over the last 5 or 10 years, starting with China's growing territorial ambitions, especially in the South China Sea, and the tensions that that's created, as well, which has been part of the broader rise of China's strategic ambitions, its interests, its efforts to translate economic influence into political influence, and really marginalize US influence in the Indo-Pacific region and perhaps globally as well. Second, the rise of cyber espionage and cyber theft, China's drive for a kind of technological mercantilism, and more recent concerns about China's export of technological tools for sort of surveillance authoritarianism. Third is the crackdown on human rights in China, in Xinjiang, as well as in Hong Kong, and concerns that creates about the situation for Taiwan and a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue. And then, you know, I think a more recent issue, which I've written about recently, is some rising concern about Chinese Communist Party interference activities in democratic systems and sort of influence operations, which we've seen in Australia, and that's what I've written about, but we're seeing in Southeast Asia and other countries across the world as well. So I think it's clear that intensifying strategic rivalry is here to stay. There is a Washington consensus around the idea that it's going to be necessary to take a tougher approach against China and really think about a long-term strategic competition with China that will be broadly encompassing across many fronts, as Dr. Dupont has said. Not everyone is in this consensus. It's not a universal consensus within the United States or within Washington, but I think it's broadly held. And it began, importantly, an important point to make is this began, a lot of these trends, a lot of these concerns really began in the Obama administration and then have been very much carried through the Trump administration. And I'll talk at the end about a potential Biden administration and what that might mean. But where are we so far with this purported emerging Cold War? You know, so far in the Trump administration, we've definitely seen a rise of a lot of action on the trade and technology war front. There's been a lot of tariffs imposed, some trade negotiations. On the trade war, there's been a lot of talk about Huawei and banning TikTok and other firms and concern about or taking action to deal with technological supply chains. And with the coronavirus pandemic, there's been concern about other supply chains as well, and not being so vulnerable on Chinese inputs or even other kinds of inputs in supply chains. So there's been a lot of action and a lot of talk around these issues. However, I would make the point that so far the trade numbers have not dramatically shifted. They've shifted a little bit in response to tariffs in recent years, but not nearly as much as the Trump administration predicted based on its actions and its negotiations and the deals that were struck. And we're in the very early stages still of real actions taken on so-called decoupling for technological supply chains or other supply chains. Again, a lot of talk about actions, but we're still in the very early stages of putting those kinds of things in place. Mostly it's been a war of words and a kind of tit for tat of sanctions against individuals and closing of consulates. So there's a lot of heat. There's a lot more of offensive diplomacy. But I would say we're still in the relatively early stages of any kind of serious decoupling. On the South China Sea also, I think, in terms of countering China's maritime ambitions, we have seen some steps that the Trump administration has made relatively recently. The declaration of a new policy, or I should say elaborating a US policy that really declares China's maritime claims illegal, and perhaps that would be backed with more action. So we've seen some steps put in place, but I think it falls well short of a coherent strategy. And whether this amounts to a new Cold War or not, I think is still very much in question. And a lot of this is somewhat definitional. How do you define a Cold War? On the one hand, as I've said, I think there's clearly a consensus that we are now in an era of great power rivalry, and that will be here for some time. And I think I think given the leadership in the United States on both sides of the political aisle, a kind of naive engagement approach to China is not going to return anytime soon. So there is going to be much more focus on competition and some confrontation, as well as cooperation. But I think, you know, although I love the analysis of my friend Alan Dupont, and when we get to the recommendations, I agree with all of them. But I'm not at the point where I think that the historical analogy of a Cold War, or calling this a new Cold War, is more helpful than it is somewhat hindering of our understanding, both of some of the underlying structural reasons for this conflict, as well as potentially guidance for how the United States and other countries should approach this strategic rivalry. In large part because the Cold War, you know, was this real bifurcation of two camps. There was very little cultural and economic linkages between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. And as Alan has pointed out, of course, there's great interdependence, a lot of economic linkages, a lot of other linkages, not just between the United States and China, I would point out, but between all the countries in the world, and especially countries in the region in Southeast Asia, for example. Countries have deep economic ties to both the United States and China and many other partners in the world. And they have very strong security ties with the United States, many of them, even if they have strong economic linkages to China. So the idea that we would decouple to the point where these countries are forced to choose and are willing and able to really, decamp from one set of relationships to side with the other, I think is just, perhaps we'll get to that point, but we're a long, long, long way from there. And it would be a very wrenching process to get there, both politically and economically, and on a whole bunch of other fronts as well. So I don't find the Cold War analogy all that helpful and illuminating personally. There is an ideological component. Certainly there's concern about China's authoritarianism and its backtracking on human rights, and some support it gives to authoritarianism or sort of backsliding from democracy, but it's not the same kind of ideological competition that occurred in the US-Soviet Cold War. I don't see proxy wars all over the globe springing up, which was a big component of the Cold War. In the same way, I think it's going to be a much softer competition in many, many respects. So this brings me, and by the way, I also think that the Thucydides trap is another very unhelpful historical analogy, which lots of other people have written on, and we can get into it if folks are interested, but I'm not sure that's all that helpful either. But this brings us to the big question: is military conflict inevitable or even likely? I mean, of course it's not inevitable. It is certainly possible, and there are flashpoints. I agree with Dr. Dupont that the two most concerning flashpoints are the South China Sea and Taiwan, but there's also the possibility of an unintended incident, an accident, a miscalculation that leads to unintended escalation. So there's concern there, but I think it's certainly avoidable. And we can talk about practical steps in the next round. But I would just say, I think that what the United States and its partners can be focused on is deterrence, both military deterrence and actions and investments that we can take, as well as strong diplomatic efforts to communicate certain red lines, although that's a tricky phrase to use, but certain expectations, and as well as communication channels for de-escalating an unintended incident. And building up and strengthening alliances and partnerships as part of this broader kind of deterrence approach. And the one thing I do want to say here is, I think we often fall into a trap of assuming, certainly in debates in Washington, there's often this sort of assumption that if you take a harder line on China, you are forfeiting cooperation because you're going to pursue more competition and confrontation. And I think we really have to question that assumption, because I don't think there's really any evidence that China will not cooperate in an area that it is in China's interest to do so because of some other action taken in another sphere, or that China, will not cooperate in an area where it is in its interest to do so. In other words, I think the evidence shows that China will cooperate when there's mutual interest in cooperation on things like certain parts of the climate change agenda, or a whole, economic issues, a whole host of other things. So, China is very adept at making this false choice seem apparent that, you must choose cooperation and engagement or conflict. But I actually think you can, if you are willing to have a strong, clear-eyed deterrence policy and demonstrate a willingness to push back and work with others to restrain Chinese assertiveness, I don't think that rules out cooperation on pandemic coordination or, a whole host of other things. So that brings me to November 3rd and the election. And, we know where Trump has been taking the China policy, but where would a Biden administration go? What would it mean for this emerging Cold War, if we want to think of it that way, or these tensions? And here I will say 5 things. First, I think, in the Trump administration, it's been characterized by a lot of unpredictability, in part because the administration is somewhat disorganized, or there's competing interests within the administration. There's not a clear rational process to bring those different interests together. And specifically, there's some inherent contradictions between the economic side, the administration that wants to get really tough on trade, and the security side that wants to build up strategic partnerships to balance against China. So we've seen things not only of Trump himself and the administration taking very tough line against Europe and kind of just damaging our relationships with our European allies, but even countries like Vietnam, this emerging strategic partnership where we're very aligned on the strategic side, we see growing, tough talk on Vietnam on the trade side. So there's a lot of internal contradictions there that I think undermine the strategy. I think a Biden administration will revert to a much more normal traditional policymaking process. And because China is such a clear priority for the United States right now and for Biden's team, I think it will receive a high level of priority in the policymaking process. And so I think it's more likely there will be an attempt to put together a very coherent strategy that will be driven by a process that will synchronize the various elements of different policies. And so we'll have a much more kind of coherent, cogent policy. That's number 1. Number 2, I think we will continue to see some building on some of the things that the Trump administration did, especially in the maritime domain. So I do think we'll continue to see some military deterrence backed by perhaps a more robust diplomacy, and in particular, an attempt to rebuild, to strengthen a very healthy set of alliances and partnerships, not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but globally, that can really work together collectively, with some collective action coordinated approaches that might be more effective. Number 3, I think Biden, everything we know about Biden and his team is that they are very dedicated to the liberal international order. And I think there's going to be a real attempt to revitalize the liberal international order with US leadership, but a broader recognition that there really needs to be a lot of multilateral cooperation with other key partners as well to do that, but revitalize in order to build kind of norms in some new areas like the cyber domain and a whole host of other things, and create opportunities for a more collective approach to solve problems and deal with various issues. Number 4 is Biden's commitment to a democracy agenda. Biden has committed to holding a summit of democracies in his first year. And the thinking behind this is to work with real like-minded countries, not only to support democratic principles and try to push back on democratic backsliding, but as a mechanism to really push forward some coordinated action on a whole host of issues, from post-pandemic efforts in the healthcare sphere to climate change to dealing with the export of surveillance, authoritarianism, and election interference, and other kinds of issues like that. So I think we're going to see a real effort on the Biden team to, again, build more of a coalition that can push back against some of the concerning things we see coming out of Beijing right now. And finally, number 5 is I think the Biden team is going to be committed to trying to revitalize the domestic institutions and politics in the United States. So there's going to be a real domestic agenda that there's going to be an attempt anyway, which there's a lot of variables involving Congress and other things, but I think there's going to be a real attempt to have more strategic investments in domestic infrastructure, in healthcare, in research and development and innovation, in education, in the things that the United States really needs to do more in to make the United States stronger at home so that it can outcompete China in a long-term competition, which we all pretty much agree is probably here to stay. I'll stop there.
Dr. Searight, thank you very much for that very comprehensive overview. That last point, very interesting, I think, in terms of that strategic rivalry, but competition pushing societies forward in terms of coming up with solutions for challenges that we have. Some really good questions coming in, which I'll get to once we get through this first round, but including questions around the role of India within all of this, looking at tech bifurcation, particularly around the internet and next generation technologies, 5G and so on, are sort of really practical issues that countries and companies are having to deal with now. And also a few questions from, I think, the sort of corporate audience about foreign direct investment, particularly US investment in China and supply chains and so on. And I'll get to as many of those as I can as we go through. But what I'd like to do now is turn to our next guest, Professor Zhu in China. Professor Zhu, thank you very much for joining us. And we've just heard a comprehensive overview of the US viewpoint from Dr. Searight there in Washington. It'd be very good to get your view from your vantage point in China. So over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Andy. I'm very happy to join you for such an excellent discussion. And first of all, let me thank RSIS and Hinrich Foundation to invite me with all of you. So then it's a very inspiring discussion. So then my presentation will start from some sort of my personal assessment of what is going on with the strategic rivalry between Beijing and Washington. Very honest, I consider it's a very premature concept for the moment, because if we use the historical empirical sources to just testify what the strategic rivalry is truly floating in air, a couple of the key elements we should just very, very explicitly sought out. First is it's a strategic regrouping. That means the geopolitically and geoeconomically, then we will see some sort of ongoing divide around the alliance and the realignments. Then such a strategic regrouping usually serve as a very underlining, the factor to just foretell how far such a strategic rival will go. Then so far we see, is there any strategic regrouping in Asia Pacific and globally? It's also always US-centered online system, US-centered security partnership, the system. What China is doing? Well, just truly desperately working on regrouping vis-a-vis the US? No. If China couldn't just restaging the strategical group regrouping, such a strategic rivalry is just some sort of illusion, because there's no way China could just fight the US on some sort of such a collected international sources. So today, where we see China is quite alone, just confronting some sort of Americans' very mounting pressure. The second factor we also needed to just push and tap very, very heavily. It is some sort of, the nature of the, rising power. China is a revisionist state. Yes, we see a lot of Western rhetoric to define the Chinese revisionist state. Yes, but we could see some sort of China's, such a moves around China's peripheral area. Usually, from the Chinese perspective, we consider we just get back to what we claimed many decades ago. It's not just a totally groundless China want, the slowing away out of the China's territory, and even just across the line and projecting the power to the many, many far place. for the geopolitical purpose. Yes, you will see China's global presence commercially is also expanding, but very, very exactly examines this Chinese move. We say it's a very mercantilist. It's a commercialist. It's not geopolitical. So then I see so far, still there is no big domestic consensus. China should embark on some sort of expansionist vehicle because we consider it will be a very deadly detriment to the China's, we say, some sort of resurgence. But commercially and socially, China's global presence will be unstoppable. The reason is, look at the Chinese. My confidence to my country is always on Chinese people. We have 1.4 million Chinese. They are very diligent, they're working hard, they love to learn, they also want to make money and have a better off for their families. So real, I think the Chinese vitality is not out of the Chinese statecraft, it's out of the Chinese people. It gets to the Chinese, of course, such a global outreach has never been massive and extensive. But the problem is, with the Chinese just have a massive access to the world, it will be also, how to say, should just, put the eyes on its geopolitical effects. I think Alan and Amy know what a big amount of the Chinese immigrated into the Sydney and to the United States. They really get it wrong with the local people. They want to integrate it into their community. It's a real Chinese cutting edge. It's based on Chinese, such a hard-working, diligent people over global reach. It's really getting, we say, bigger and stronger. But I don't think such a global reach is really present any geopolitical meaning. Then the Chinese government could also see such a worldwide spread of Chinese will be their strategic sources. No. If the Chinese government will see that, I consider it's also very stupid. But the problem is, it's such an overseas Chinese with the diasporas really become a leading force to speed up the China's domestic transition and also get the China's global integration couldn't stoppable and reversible. It's a very positive force to redirect today's China. Then, third factor, to very exactly define the strategic rival. That means that China's military capability will become a real near-peer competitor to US. Is that situation now happening? How many wars and military actions US did overseas in the past 3 decades? Then, compared to China, what kind of winning battles we can just easily figure out to support the China's such a, we say, re-emerging military capability? No, China's military power remains very nascent. Yes, there's a lot of domestic, necessity. Then we will see a lot of some sort of new equipments could just boost the China's military confidence, but they're not tested. They're not just how they magnified in any single real, the military battle. So then I think the American people and our Western friends really exaggerate how powerful China's military mind is. Then on the other hand, we also see such a military spending is also very natural, some sort of a ticking off of the China's growing, national budget, because this country needed some sort of manufacturing capability and also emerging and ascending. So military spending also becomes some sort of spontaneous, extension of the China's, expanded budget and also growing power, growing stronger, the domestic manufacturing. But it's a real effect of the military combative capability. It's largely untested. So then my definition is, yes, China-US relations now is getting touchy and getting risky, but the strategic rivalry at some sort of equal footing remain very, very far. Because there's no some sort of such a solidified elements we can easily figure out to support our hypothesis. Such a strategic rivalry is totally and fully unfolding. But why? So strategic rivalry becomes some sort of leading discourse in some sort of a China, assessment. I think two reasons for my understanding. First is it's a very powerful extension of a hegemonic logic in thinking and acting on today's world, because US remain very powerful. No one can rival the US easy. But the problem is there's a growing strategic anxiety. Americans at least also afraid. So with the Chinese ascendant, then the US hegemonic, superiority also will be loaded. But I don't think such a thing now is some sort of a reality. Instantly, we will see, yes, China is a rising power. There's no some sort of things we can just shame off from the Chinese getting stronger and getting better. But why? When the China's endorsement to get the Chinese stronger and better, US will return to China in some sort of such a very, very detrimental and also very, very harmful China's effect to the world peace. To be honest, it's really unfair to today's China. So my generation of Chinese witnessed the entire 4 decades transition of my country. When I get into the Peking University as an undergraduate student, back to the early 80s, I used the coupon to have the food. I was not starved, but I had a little food to eat. But 40 decades later, China is getting much better. Then a getting better China also well deserve Americans some sort of such a detrimental and also very, very, with an awful, pushing back and taking China into some sort of such an enemy? No. So I just, want to ask for some sort of, scholarly and practically some sort of, fair examination of what China now is. And after the 4 decades of China's great, endorsement, what sort of today's China's international standing? Well, just returning the Chinese for their hard working, for their generation-long, diligence. We need some sort of such a balanced, answer. Then another point is pandemic. I see past a couple of months is some sort of a breaking point. The Trump administration is just taking China as a punch bag. So they just are trying to hit in China hard. But I have to say, some degree it's the effects of a pandemic, such an irritation. Because when we're back to the last January, then we will see that Trump has never been more popular and welcome. His re-election chance also had never been just the way shining and reassured. But the pandemic almost just overblown all such a Trump's great promise to being a great president, to being a great the chance to be re-elected. I know how bad Trump's feeling to China now is. So then he wants just hit to China with his pandemic retaliation to Chinese. Never forget when the Wuhan just got into the lockdown on the January 23rd, up to until the March 13th, the US just got into the public health emergency. Trump publicly just praised the Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping and the Chinese for the Chinese policy resolution and Xi's some sort of belovedness and even China's openness and transparency in combating the pandemic. But when some sort of a pandemic outbreak just getting so worse and so horrifying, then Trump totally changed his mood and changed his basic tone over China. So today I see some sort of escalating confrontation between the US, China, partly just get stuck in the Trump's personality-driven pandemic retaliation to China, but partly just in some sort of Americans, you know, the China hawks just trying to use this chance to just how to say punch the China even in some sort of a daily way. Because for most of American elites, you consider pandemic is not a public health crisis. Pandemic maybe will leave the China open the window and get to the balance of power just shifting in Chinese favor. Is that true? Today, China's domestic economy also just losing the speed. Some sort of unemployment things also will become a very hard, you know, the challenge to China is also just getting difficult to overcome. I also have to tell you that China's re-emergency in the coming years also will hit the snag, also just how to say, floating down into some sort of low economic growth, particularly some sort of such a domestic effects also will have never been getting more complicated. So China's domestic complexity also will be getting hardening. That's why I don't think the Cold War is what China wants. First, it's unfair to return China with the Cold War. Second, Cold War will be detrimental to the China's interest. So last words is, let's just getting back to some sort of a sobering reality. Please have a very just adequate assessment and appreciation of what the China factor now is in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and for giving us again a comprehensive view from China, and particularly that sort of domestic focus that you have there. A good number of questions coming in, particularly related to some of the themes that you raised there. Some difficult issues that were raised earlier on by Professor Searight as well, particularly around the South China Sea, that I'd like to get to. But I'd like now to move on to Professor Liow. We've been talking a little bit, well, we've been talking mainly on US-China relations at the moment, but Dr. Dupont was also referencing the potential and actual role of Singapore as well. I'd like now to get that perspective from Southeast Asia, and Singapore has traditionally had that very fine line to walk between its big brother up in China and its big friend across the Pacific as well. So, Professor, over to you on these things. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're basically still walking that line, that fine line, very precariously, tiptoeing. Let me share some thoughts on the discussion that we've had thus far. Thank you. It was quite fantastic points. I learned a lot. In fact, looking at the Q&A as well, there's a lot for us to get into for the last half hour. So I'll try to keep my comments short, and then I'll quickly address Alan's point about Singapore. First, let me say that since we've started we used the Cold War as the point of entry. I'm a big believer in history. I don't believe that there is nothing to learn from history. But on the other hand, it's important that we learn the right lessons from history and approach it with a critical lens. Yeah. So let me make 3 points. The first is all this talk about decoupling between US and China as a sort of a fundamental driver of this other discussion about the impending so-called impending new Cold War. I think that there will be some decoupling. In fact, there has already been decoupling, especially in the technology sphere, which predated the downturn in Sino-US relations, for that matter. But on the other hand, I think it's quite unimaginable to think of a sort of full or fundamental decoupling. I mean, there are something like 70,000 American companies operating in China, right, generating revenues in excess of $700-800 billion. I mean, how to fathom a full decoupling with that kind of context, I really don't know, and I suspect that the current American president doesn't know either, but it makes for good sort of saber rattling. Globalization and interdependence is really a reality, and certainly in Southeast Asia, we accept that and we are working within that context. This is not to say that there's nothing wrong with globalization, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of problems with it, but the question is, do you then throw the baby out with the bathwater? Yeah, and this is, we're having a lot, obviously we're having a lot of discussions globally about how to sort of recalibrate globalization. But the main point is that it cannot be wished away by populists, by nationalism, and a virus, a pandemic might slow it down, but will not entirely eliminate it. This issue of globalization and interdependence, speaking to a point that Alan made, it certainly does not make war unlikely, but as we know, it increases the costs, yeah, of conflict, and these costs have to be taken into consideration. Now, as to the new Cold War, sometimes I think that it is essentially just a question of semantics, right? Calling the current situation between the US and China if you call it a new Cold War, it doesn't make the prospect of hostilities more or less. Yeah, the issue is not whether it's a Cold War or not. The issue is that you're looking at escalating tension across a wide range of issues, right? And Alan articulated that very, very precisely. And more importantly, the absence of what we call an obvious or an absence of off-ramps as compared to bilateral relations in earlier phases, where there was competition, but there were efforts to find common ground and to mitigate some of these tensions. Significantly less so today, with the possible exception, ironically, of the trade relationship, which actually started all this, right? So that's something to bear in mind. And another thing about the Cold War analogy, and I think Amy touched on this very correctly. Two defining characteristics of it, as we know in hindsight. Number one, it never became hot, yeah. And number two, it was defined by proxy wars. And this is very important in the context of ASEAN and smaller states more generally, because we talk about the Thucydides trap and the Peloponnesian War. One thing that, and what that teaches or doesn't teach us about great power relations, that's all well and good and very important. But one thing we need to remember about the Peloponnesian War in 431 was it started when two small states who were clients of the superpowers came to blows, yeah, Thebes and Plataea. So it's not about the big powers, it's about how smaller states have positioned themselves. That seems to have been lost in the discussion of that historical analogy. So that's my first sort of big point. The second big point is some observations on the global power structure. Yeah. Indeed, I certainly agree that we are looking at a systemic phenomenon here. Alan is correct to suggest that because of that, it's a bit different from other great power conflicts. But at the same time, we need to realize that the global power structure may be hierarchical, but it is the dynamism of different configurations involving different states and different powers that is just as important. And I think this speaks to, again, Alan's observation of the importance for middle powers and other states with significant capabilities, perhaps not across the board, but in specific areas. Some people used to call it niche diplomacy back in the day, right? But the whole idea that these states can bring to bear things onto the international system that can help move it along against this dark cloud of the superpower rivalry between the US and China. So the idea here is not to place all eggs in one basket. And this is very much what ASEAN has been trying to do or avoid doing, so to speak, and it continues to do so. And that leads me to my third and final point about ASEAN and agency for ASEAN. I think that amidst all this talk about the new Cold War, I think it is very important for ASEAN to, if not own its narrative, certainly to control it. What do I mean by that? There's talk about the new Cold War, there's talk about choosing sides, right? I mean, the sort of a manifestation of that tension in the discourse in Southeast Asia is this whole idea of, you know, should we be choosing sides? We don't want to choose sides, etc. We really should, we as in ASEAN, really should move away from talking about choices, you know, and wringing our hands over this issue of choices, and to talk about the growing convergence of interests and outlooks in Southeast Asia against superpower, against this backdrop of superpower rivalry. Yeah, I mean, Prime Minister Lee, for one, has talked about the sort of historical encounters that Southeast Asia has always had and will continue to have with great powers. In the context of that historical encounters, there is a sense of the Southeast Asian states being in the same boat, being afflicted by the same challenges, so to speak. So that is what I think the region should focus more of its attention on. This is not to, you know, I'm not saying this as a call, you know, to be ignorant or naive of the geopolitical reality of Sino-US rivalry, but it is to shift the focus from that to the question of autonomy and carving out space by the region, for the region, which is crucial for the future of Southeast Asia. And this gets to the issue of ASEAN unity, the perennial issue that the region grapples with. I think the need to work in concert is imperative to generate the maximum degree of regional autonomy in the face of superpower competition. And I do think that we are beginning to see some realization of that among Southeast Asian states. Even some appreciation that we actually share more in terms of our strategic outlooks towards the relationship between the US and China and its implications for the region. We share more in our outlooks on that than we want to believe. Yeah, but the question is, how does that then translate to a regional position, regional the policies of regional states towards the sort of increasing tension in US-China relations? And this is it's a big challenge for ASEAN, and this is something that they are very aware of and have been trying to sort of hold the line against. I won't get into the details, but happy to get into some details on that with the Q&A. And the final observation about Singapore, I think, Alan, your point about the importance of multilateral institutions, multilateral norms and rules, international law, these are values that are very much aligned with Singapore's outlook towards the region. And as far as I'm aware of, Singapore's view is very much not only that obviously Sino-US tensions will start to cool off, that hopefully level heads will prevail both in DC and in Beijing, but at the same time, the importance for us to defend and reinforce the international institutions that have been created and that has, by and large, for the most part, served the international community well over the last few decades. So I'll end there, and we can get to the questions.
Excellent, thank you very much. Yes, and firstly, thank you very much for bringing in that perspective and ending on that note of multinational institutions and alliances and so on. Let's come to that in a moment. I also liked your points there on convergence of interests, which we could map out as climate change, public health, development, education, and so on. You know, much more positive story there. However, quite a few of the questions that have come up are of a much more sort of strategic nature, and I'd like to focus in on the South China Sea. This was raised a little bit earlier on as you know, potential triggers for a further deterioration of relations between the US and China. But also, let's not forget that the South China Sea is where we see competition, or we see strategic competition and disputes between China and Southeast Asian nations as well. So I guess this is a question to Professor Zhu, but also would like to get comment in from Alan Dupont and also from for Dr. Searight as well. This is a really intractable issue. China has its 9-9. China has made move to occupy, build on reefs and shoals and so on within the South China Sea, which is creating tensions with not just with the United States, but with other nations within the region as well. And this also goes to another question that we had about trust within the relationship. Why is trust between the two powers deteriorated? And I think that the sort of linkage between the two there, that by militarizing these reefs and shoals within the South China Sea, and that trust between nations has deteriorated. So where do we go from here? Professor Zhu, we do have these real concrete challenges, physical challenges around China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. How do we deal with those without escalating tensions?
Okay, thank you for your question. I think the South China Sea issue has been some sort of very, we say, big distraction from the China-ASEAN, relation improvements. So I also feel very, to be honest, very regret over why some sort of such a solution so always getting so hard to just move ahead. But I see a couple of the factors we could easily just figure out behind some sort of non-settlement of the South China Sea disputes yet. First is, then we will see very controversial and even contending, the claims based on history and even the law, reference. Then I see a lot of Chinese scholars that consider, both historically and legally, we're also being in better position to claim. Then I think it's also very easily, proved, because after the defeat of the imperialist Japan, then we see South China Sea such islands, isolates, just parasol and sporadically just return to China. So it's also some sort of outcome international, the conventions. But the key challenge is after the early 70s, then they will see when China just got mild in the Cultural Revolution, then the ASEAN claimant states just went after the occupy those islands and isolates. Then when Beijing just get into from the opening up the phase, it's almost 2 decades or 3 decades past since China just trying to reclaim. So then I see such a historical complexity has never been a more, some sort of a disturbing and disruptive. So then I really realistically think that China and the ASEAN countries could back off equally. Then we should rebuild the status quo in some sort of such a controversial territorial claim, and just real find some sort of, a solution to get things settled. But politically and diplomatically, it's not easy, because it's also equally very inflammatory factors on either's domestic politics.
So let me just jump in there then and take those comments to Dr. Dupont. Historically challenging, difficult to see a way forward in the South China Sea, but clearly a trigger point. How do we de-escalate the risk there?
Well, it's going to be very difficult to de-escalate the risk now because China has effectively militarized and garrisoned these disputed islands. So the time to de-risk that particular trigger point, if you like, was 4 or 5 years ago, before China did what it did, right? But now it's occupied those islands. It's much more difficult to de-risk it, because now there's a question of loss of face. The Chinese government has put a lot into risk-taking, if you like, to do what it's done. So it's pretty difficult to see China unraveling what it has done, that is, pulling out its garrisons and going back to the Arbitration Commission in The Hague. It clearly won't do that. So there's unfortunately, limited capacity now to de-risk that. However, if you're asking me what we could do that might have a meaningful impact, I would say that China should take the whole issue of the disputes in the South China Sea, to which it claims 90% ownership, back to some form of negotiation, whether it's a multilateral dialogue of the disputing states, South China Sea workshops that will be going on now for 20 years, or whether it's prepared to allow some degree of international adjudication over these disputes. Because the key point is this: these islands that China has occupied are disputed islands. Yes, China has claims to it, but so do 4 other countries. So if you then go and just occupy disputed islands, then what is the message you send to the rest of the region? That might is right. You can argue about respective claims, but to actually physically occupy those islands and build them up into substantial military garrisons, that's the other point. It's pretty difficult to build trust when you do that. And I think it's been enormously destructive of China's reputation, not only in the region, but internationally. So China has to make some accommodations, and it has shown no sign of doing that. In fact, it's got worse, because China is now pushing further south into, for example, areas that Indonesia owns in the Natuna Sea. So, you know, it's not like this is the end of it all. It's still going on. So this assertiveness and aggressiveness on China's part, I think, has been quite counterproductive to China's interests. I don't think it's supportable under any version of international law that I've seen. And in fact, the Arbitral Commission, when it made its recommendations on those disputed islands, said that the Chinese claim to 90% of the South China Sea, including those islands, had no basis in international law. So I don't see what case China has got to make against that conclusion. I think it's been quite detrimental to its interests.
Okay. Let me move on, and Professor Searight, if I could come to you on this issue of building alliances, but also bringing in other powers such as India, which we haven't covered in this conversation as well. On the one hand, there's an opportunity for particularly the US, and perhaps under a Biden administration, to revisit those multilateral institutions and those alliances that the US has had. There's also, it would seem to be, an opportunity to be pushing on an open door. China has territorial issues with India, with Japan, and with other countries in Southeast Asia. So there would seem to be an opportunity for the US to be building those alliances. How do you see that unfolding? Is that a likely path? A, under a second Trump administration, and B, under a Biden administration?
So I think that Trump has been very clear, not just in his, 3.5 years of his administration, but going back decades. Everything he said and wrote, since the 1980s has shown that he has a very transactional approach to all relationships and a real skepticism about alliances. He just does not see value in alliances and partnerships that, in his view, it's very much about the United States providing support for others and not getting anything in return. So I think if the Trump administration were to win another 4 years, I think we would see a continuation of a real deterioration of alliances and partnerships. And to the point where, many have predicted, and including some in his own administration, former administration officials, that Trump would likely withdraw from NATO. And I think, withdrawing a lot of troops from South Korea and elsewhere is also very likely in the cards. So I think that could not be more clear based on Trump's views of alliances and just wanting, the America First kind of policy, just doesn't see a value in a sort of coordinated effort on even big issues like China. The Biden administration, I think there's real alarm, not just among, Democratic foreign policy specialists, but Republicans as well, and all kind. The entire foreign policy establishment is pretty much horrified by what's happened in the past 3.5 years in terms of our deteriorating alliances. And so I think there's going to be a lot of support for going back to building up, reshoring our alliances, building up healthy relationships, with an eye towards the populist view out there that the United States does need to ask, NATO members to make their fair contributions and all the rest of it. But I think there's definitely going to be a real effort to build alliances. And, the Trump administration, to be fair, has continued building some emerging strategic partnerships, which were begun not only under Obama, but in many cases under the previous administration, George W. Bush, starting with India and Vietnam and some other countries in the region as well. I think we'll likely see a real doubling down of a Biden administration on building those strategic partnerships. I think the one wrinkle, and I think where it'll be interesting to watch, I think where the contradictions are going to come in is the pro-democracy agenda that Biden is very committed to, and I think makes a lot of sense for where the United States has to be to restore its leadership and revitalize a lot of things in the international system. And yet a lot of our strategic partnerships are with countries that are backsliding on democracy or democratic norms, including, Vietnam is not a democracy clearly, and countries like Thailand, the Philippines, and even India are backsliding in many ways. So I think that's going to be the interesting dilemma or tension within a Biden foreign policy, is going to be how to deal with countries that may not be living up to, perhaps their professed democratic ideals, and yet are clearly important alliances or strategic partnerships that need to be shored up.
Professor Su, if I could come back to you, Professor Searight there was just outlining what a second Trump administration would look like, what a potential Biden administration would look like, particularly in terms of foreign policy. From your perspective in China, who would China like to see in the White House?
Good question, but to be honest, I see no such easy solutions whoever just came to the power. Once again, Trump administration number 2 or Biden administration number 1, because I see some sort of such a deterioration and an escalation of the tensions come from a full spectrum, some sort of a consensus. So then it's not just the House of Republican hawks, but even the Democratic liberals. They consider China now is deserve some sort of very strong and hard pushback. On the other hand, we also see even the Biden become the president, he will highlight some sort of a human rights, disputes between the two countries. Then he also just publicly vowed to greet the Dalai Lama in White House if he become the president. All such things will be just inflame the bilateral relations in a very emotional way. But the problem is, I of course consider the Biden administration will be probably the last chance to salvage our bilateral relations from getting much worse and unstoppable, worse. The reason is President Biden will be a reasonable and sublime-minded people, but Trump is very emotional. No principle Biden. It is very, erratic in just outputting his China policy. So then I have to say the second term of Trump administration will be hard to predict or what will be happening around the Strait of the confrontation. So then that's why I consider that Biden will be some sort of a silver lining if we want to just back off from precipitating a military conflict.
Okay, thank you. I'd like now to turn our attention a little bit more to looking at the future. And right at the outset, Dr. Dupont was talking about some policy steps that we could be looking at to mitigate risk, and more positive areas. Professor Liow was talking about the convergence of interest as well. And Professor Liow, if I could come back to you on a specific issue. At the Hinrich Foundation, we're all about promoting sustainable trade that's mutually beneficial, and so on. We know that Asia has been a massive beneficiary, as has China, of access to the global trading system in terms of fostering economic development as well. What role do multilateral regional free trade agreements, for example, the RCEP or the CPTPP, what role can they play in trying to mitigate the risk in building trust between all players within the region?
Well, I think they do play a very crucial role. And in fact, these institutions, whether it's bilateral free trade agreements or more multilateral initiatives, these have been growing over the decades. And I think they provide that, that opportunity to come to a common understanding globally among the participants on each other's the opportunities as well as constraints. I mean, we cannot assume that free trade, the benefits of free trade are obvious to all. I mean, you look at the what happened with the RCEP and the barriers that India encountered and its subsequent, hopefully temporary withdrawal from the discussions. Another challenge for free trade is that whereas the benefits of free trade agreements take some time to actually materialize and to be seen as tangible on the part of the people, the population, populists and nationalists easily stoke up the opposition to such agreements in what I personally feel, in most instances, very simplistic kind of way. Yeah, but it gets traction. Yeah, so that has become an impediment to efforts at enhancing international trade through these institutions and these agreements as well. But that is not to say that we should not continue to try to refine them and improve them. I think the question of parity, equality, in the context of these agreements has surfaced as something that is very important, both nationally as well as internationally among the various dialogue partners who are involved in any given agreement or initiative. And so that has to be taken very much into account in the negotiation process as well. But if you ask me, at the end of the day, I think it is quite imperative for not just economic development, but stability, international stability, that we have these institutions, that they are functioning at an effective level. Yeah, so some of these institutions need to be tweaked. WTO among others, and then RCEP as well. We need to sort of push it through the finish line, right?
So Dr. Dupont, if I could come back to you, because going right back to your original thesis, we're talking about trade and technology as key components in the emergence of this new Cold War that you termed it. How then can we take trade as a more positive stepping off point? And actually, could I pose it to you that trade seems to be one of the bright points in the relationship between the US and China? That's where they're talking. We've just had discussions on the phase 1 deal and thinking about phase 2, and so at least there's some dialogue going on there. Whereas if we look at things like South China Sea and Taiwan, then there's a lot more tension. So can trade play a role in de-risking the new Cold War?
Well, absolutely, yes. And I agree with everything Joseph said about the importance of having multilateral trade regimes of various kinds, free trade agreements. It's very important because what's the alternative? The alternative is a power-based trading system or autarky. That is, you're totally independent. Well, nobody can be independent in trade terms. So if you don't have a rules-based system, even if it's a flawed one, what's the alternative? It's whoever's biggest gets what they want. And I think the problem with the US-China trade conflict, particularly with the US under Donald Trump, is that Trump is using the US economic weight to get deals that obviously advantage the United States. Now that's not unusual in any kind of competitive environment, but you'd like to think that everybody should benefit from international trade, and therefore you've got to have a rules-based system. And if you're not happy with the rules-based system, as Trump isn't, for example, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, surely it's better to fix it rather than throw it out into the rubbish bin. And Donald Trump's approach has been to excoriate the WTO but not suggest an alternative to it, other than we, the US, will negotiate whatever deal we want, and we'll use our weight to get the best possible deal. Okay? So if everybody goes down that track, we have a total breakdown of international trade and a worsening of the Cold War. Well, I think it's Cold War, obviously, but a worsening of the situation. So the arguments I've made in the paper of the Hinrich Foundation are that here are some things that we need to fix about the existing WTO. You can argue about the merits of them, but it's a better way to go. And I hope that if there is a Biden administration in the White House, that they will look at that more, because this goes towards the second issue of alliance building. You know, you've got to have everybody, you've got to empower multilateralism again, otherwise, again, you know, you're just going to get a breakdown of whatever rules-based system has been there before, even if it's a flawed one. Better to fix the flaws. That's the way I look at it, and certainly in trade. And there's opportunities to do that. If I could just say one other thing, because this flows into the whole decoupling, right, which is very important. Okay, so what happens? Is it conceivable that the US and China could divorce? You know, that's the worst case. That's decoupling in extremis. I don't think anybody seriously believes that's going to happen, because they're too connected. But there is going to be some degree of decoupling. It's already started. Some people argue that China actually began it a decade ago, but wherever you are on that debate, it's clearly happening. So my argument has been, you can't turn back the tide on decoupling. What we have to have is managed decoupling. That is, there will be some degree of separation, technologically and in trade and geopolitical terms, between the US and China, and maybe globally. That'll play out in different ways, but we've got to make sure it doesn't get out of hand and we don't go down the road to divorce. So my argument has been, we have to accept some degree of separation and compare with the old globalization model, but it's got to be thought through. It's going to be not a one-size-fits-all, and every country's going to have to work out, you know, in what areas do we want to be sovereign in? Do we want to produce our own health equipment, or PPEs and all that sort of thing? What sort of strategic industries do we need to actually ring fence ourselves for resilience reasons and sovereignty reasons, but still enjoy the benefits of multilateral trade and cooperation? That's the hard thing. What's the balance? It's a new balance. We're shifting away from the old system, just-in-time global supply chains, all that's sort of, that is now under a lot of pressure. But we don't want to go down the road to divorce. So where's the new balance? And that's a question every country has to ask itself, and every country is going to come up with a different answer.
Alan, thank you very much. And we've just got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go to the rest of the panel and just ask for a 60-second wrap-up or of a key point that's come up in this conversation, or something that hasn't been raised in this conversation that you think people should keep in mind as we conclude this session. Dr. Dupont was talking about the realities of strategic decoupling. Dr. Searight, if I could come to you.
Yeah, well, on this, topic of economic, the economic side of statecraft, I think the point I would make is, we've talked a little bit about military deterrence and strategic rivalry and trust, but when it comes to the steps the United States needs to take to build up alliances and partnerships to be able to create more coordinated actions and pushback to have any kind of hope of really being able to restrain some of the more aggressive aspects of Chinese behavior. An economic, policy pillar is going to be absolutely central. I was in the Obama administration during the time of the pivot or the rebalance, and we always heard from our partners, as much as they enjoyed, I was in the Pentagon, and we always heard as much as they appreciated the military side of the rebalance, they were very concerned that there wasn't sufficient energy being put in at the time on the economic side, the trade side. In the United States, the foundation of the U.S. power in the entire post-war period is not just based on its military might, it's based on its normative appeal as well as its economic cooperation and leadership. The United States built the GATT, which became the WTO, and built all of these trade relationships, agreements, and heavy American investment. And that is still recognized as an incredibly valuable contribution that the United States makes. And so I think it's very one-sided for a United States administration to think that they can just go out into the world sort of, trying to boost hard power and do tough talk and have an effective outcome. You need to build a coalition, and you need to have an appeal that's based on normative ideals as well, and a vision, as well as economic cooperation. So the Biden administration is going to have to figure out, as difficult as the domestic politics in the United States are right now around trade, they're going to have to figure out how they can move forward with more, not just reforming the WTO, but having a real trade and investment agenda of cooperation with other partners.
Thank you very much for that point there. And again, we just got 2 minutes left. So Professor Hsu, in 60 seconds, if you could give us your final comment.
Yeah, I think decoupling is really a key concern for both powers, not to just escalate their confrontation. Where we see the mutual independence usually is a very strong engine to drive not just some sort of a better for both people, but also for the world. But now some sort of decoupling is really based on the, dismantling of the world rule. So rule-based world, if the decoupling is just a go in some sort of very strategic way, we'll see the rule-based order will be collapsed. That's what I'm truly worried very deeply.
Thank you very much. And Professor Liow, in the last 60 seconds, your final comment. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to shoot off what I think the states of Southeast Asia should be aware of in dealing with US and China. The first is, of course, when they make choices, it has to be based on interest and not one particular great power or the other. The second is they need to be mindful of interference in domestic politics, because that is an expression of some of this tension between the US and China. Third, they need to be mindful of their neighborhood, because if you do make a choice or if you do make a concession, it sends signals out, right, whether you like it or not. And these signals will be picked up. Number four, diversification. This again is a very important point. Diversification of relationships and cooperation beyond just US and China. And number five, stressing international law. And I cannot stress this enough. International law was designed to mitigate the law of the jungle, warts and all. It does not eliminate power politics, but it increases the cost of strategic pressure if exerted on small states. Yeah. So, and we as small states need to embrace that.
Thank you very much. And we are exactly on time. I'd just like to extend my thanks to everybody for dialing in to this. I hope you found it as engaging and as insightful as I have. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists who've taken the time to join us today from various parts of the world. There's a lot of questions that we didn't get to. Sorry for that, but we did cover a lot of ground in this conversation. And I would say that there'd be no shortage of opportunities for us to re-engage on these issues in the coming weeks and months, and particularly as we get closer to that election in Singapore. So once, in America.
We're done with ours.
Yes, yeah. So once again, thank you very much. I should stress that you can find Dr. Dupont's paper on the HeinrichFoundation.com website, and I do thoroughly recommend that to you as a great read. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to pass back now to RSIS. Thank you.